Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the University of Illinois Alumni Association's latest Speaker Series event. My name is Dave Bambry, and I serve as the Assistant Vice President for Alumni and Student Engagement at the University of Illinois Alumni Association. Tonight, we kick off the Career Connections portion of the UIAA Speaker Series, which is meant to be about professional and personal growth and development. During our past Speaker Series events, we have featured faculty as part of the Alumni College portion of the Speaker Series, and have also heard from university leadership who have taken part in our University Updates events. I would encourage you all to check out our website at uiaa.org, or to keep an eye out on your email for further communication about future Speaker Series events and other offerings at the Alumni Association. One quick item of housekeeping before we introduce our speaker. I would encourage you all to utilize the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to submit a question. We have allotted time at the end of our session to have a Q&A with our speaker, and we'll work hard to answer as many questions as possible before the end of our hour together. So let's get into tonight's session. We have a wonderful colleague with us from the university who is presenting on a topic that is so very important, and we are honored that he has agreed to share his knowledge and expertise with us this evening. Ross Wantland works with the University of Illinois Office of the Vice Chancellor for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, supporting campus units to create fair-minded and socially just organizations. Previously, Ross had worked in diversity and social justice education and the Women's Resource Center. Ross lives in Champaign with his partner, child, and their expanded pandemic garden. Without further delay, please join me in welcoming Ross Wantland.
Awesome. Thank you so much, David. And thank you to the University of Illinois Alumni Association. Thank you to the Career Center. I'm going to share my screen real quick. I want to start by acknowledging the lands that the University of Illinois is upon, that we are on the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Mascoutin, Odawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. These lands are the ancestral lands of these native nations prior to their forced removal, and the lands that we are on continue to carry the stories of these nations and their struggles for survival and identity. In addition, the University of Illinois was built with money from tribal lands in the westward expansion, built from that wealth from selling those lands. So the University of Illinois, we have a responsibility to acknowledge the peoples of these lands and the histories of dispossession that have allowed for the growth of the institution for 150 years and reflect upon this history. As I think about our conversation tonight around how do we acknowledge and look at the impact of racism, I think part of what we have to do is acknowledge our history and acknowledge where we've been. And one of those things is the ways in which the land that we're on and the peoples of the land that we're on. If you're interested in learning more, I encourage you to go to the Chancellor's website, where there is more information about the University of Illinois Land Acknowledgement, if this is your first time seeing it. So my name is Ross. I work with the Office of the Vice Chancellor for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, which is a mouthful. But a couple of things that I get to do there is I get to do a lot of training and consulting and continue some work thinking about how do we create more just, fair, equitable spaces, and what does that look like? And tonight we're going to talk a lot about racism and how racism shows up and what that looks like. I want to tell you a little bit about OVC-DEI, and then I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself. In OVC-DEI, we work to create this open, just, and welcoming community for all, trying to use the transformational power of the university to make our community increasingly diverse and inclusive. And some of what we do is everything from community development, helping minority-owned businesses in Illinois, education and training, supporting, among other, our DACA and undocumented students on campus, work with compliance and supporting individuals who have experienced discrimination or individuals who need accommodations, as well as data analysis, as well as helping understand how could our campus be more equitable? Where are some of the soft spots or the gaps of work we need to do? Some of the main offices that are part of our area is the Title IX office, which deals with gender-based violence, as well as pregnant students, staff, and faculty. The Office of Access and Equity, which deals with accommodations, complaints about discrimination or mistreatment, also our affirmative action processes around equal employment, our business and community and economic development, which I talked about in terms of supporting minority-owned businesses, helping the university have an easier path to partnering with minority-owned businesses in the state of Illinois, as well as academic inclusive excellence, which is the office that I get a chance to work with, which supports a variety of programs to help our campus be more equitable and fair. So to give you a little bit of background about me, I've worked on campus for about 20 years. In that time, as was mentioned in the bio, I've worked with the Women's Resources Center with an office called Diversity and Social Justice Education, and that's been the bulk of my professional career. So when I think about how does racism appear within the workplace, I think a lot about higher education, but I know there's a lot of other places and ways that, that our professional settings influence how racism shows up. I also want to acknowledge that I am a white dude talking about racism. And so the ways in which I think about racism have not come to me on my own. These have been lessons that I have had the opportunity to learn from many of my mentors, many of whom were women of color who have been a part of my journey and who offered me feedback and challenged me and questioned me and helped me to learn more about the ways that racism operates around us. And so I want to acknowledge that as well, the ways in which I show up in this space, and also the ways that I'm not always going to get it, and I'm still learning. There's a lot that I'm still learning. As part of that, I also want to acknowledge and think about the moment that we're in right now. So when we first scheduled this, there were several moments that we find ourselves in right now that we hadn't dreamt of yet. So I want to acknowledge that we are talking about racism in the presence and aftermath of the shootings in Atlanta, of the rise in anti-Asian violence that accompanies anti-Asian violence we've seen since the start of COVID and prior to that, that we're in the moment where the trial in Minneapolis is happening right now at the same time as we're mourning the loss of another life of a young Black man in Minneapolis. And so thinking about the ways in which we show up and how that impacts us as well, because I know that that's probably on our minds as we're entering into this conversation. So I want to say, I think that's appropriate and we're all thinking about that, and we can probably bring that into the Q&A and have some ways of thinking and talking about how that enters into the workplace. My assumptions in this conversation is that we have a lot of forms of marginalization that impact us in the various spaces we live and work and breathe, our schools, our workplaces, our communities. I had a few notes when this announcement went out asking, are you going to talk about this thing as well? What about, and I think all of these are really important, and we have to also think intersectionally. Tonight, we're going to talk about racism, and we're going to think about some of the ways that racism particularly appears. And these are all really important things for us to talk about. But racism, sexism, ableism, classism, anti-Semitism, they all harm our spaces that we're in. Also, I believe that we all hold biases and stereotypes that we've been taught and that, or that we've learned in different ways that may even be about groups of people that we're a part of. and that we've all been impacted by these systems of inequality. And I think for some of us, that has meant we've been the beneficiaries of those systems of inequality. And for some of us, we've been targeted by those systems. Because this impacts all of us, because this has negative impacts on all of us, I would say, we each have a role and responsibility to understand how we show up for fairness and equity. And also, just a little caveat, we only are going to have so many minutes together tonight, an hour tops. And so this conversation is only scratching the surface. It's only at the beginning. So let's talk about what race is, and let's define a little bit about what we think about as racism. So race is a socially constructed concept. When we think about a concept like whiteness, whiteness has only existed as a term since the early 1600s. But we see this kind of label of race change over time. Some of it is based on physical characteristics, ancestral heritage, cultural or ethnic affiliations, cultural history, but it's based on the needs of a society at a given time. And as we see in the United States, racial categories subsume ethnic groups. So we have an overarching category like Latinx, but that includes many different ethnicities and a very wide diversity of individuals who get kind of lumped into this term Latinx. Racism then is this system of beliefs and behaviors that is based in the presumed superiority of the white race. Now, I think that, and I'll talk about this a little bit, that the system believes in this superiority. That doesn't necessarily mean the individuals have to believe in this superiority for the system to exist. So these may be intentional or unintentional, conscious or unconscious. They may be interpersonal between people. They may be institutional, like things that happen in rules, laws, policies, governmental decisions. And it results in the pressing down, the oppression of folks of color to the benefit of white folks. One definition I like says that if we have racial prejudice plus this social power, that's what racism looks like. So a system of belief around racial prejudice that is empowered so that there is a status given to folks. Ta-Nehisi Coates in Between the World and Me has this great quote that says, race is the child of racism, not the father. And the process of dividing people by race has never been a matter of genealogy and physiognomy so much as one of hierarchy. And I think that that for me really helps me think about, like, is race the problem or is racism the problem? And for me and for this conversation, I want us to think about how racism appears. And where is it? How is it that race is maybe a byproduct of this desire to categorize folks and create different status structures for folks? Ibram Kendi, who's been very famous, I think, over the past year, as people have talked a lot more about this notion of anti-racism, said, this is the constant function of racist ideas and of any kind of bigotry more broadly, to manipulate us into seeing people as the problem instead of the policies that ensnare them. I really like this because I think that when we talk about racism, sometimes we spend a lot of time thinking about whether an individual person is racist. Did an individual person do something that's racist? Has their behavior risen to the place of, is it that we would name it racist or not? And what this quote and what others say about racism is that it doesn't really matter. It's not about the individuals, it's about the system. And it's about this sort of like impact that a system of operating can have upon people. So the Aspen Institute defines structural racism then as a system in which public policies, institutional practices, cultural representations, and other norms work in various, often reinforcing ways to perpetuate racial group inequality. So creating these privileges associated with whiteness or presumptions around whiteness, as well as disadvantages associated with color that endure and adapt over time. So it's really, it becomes embedded in the rules, spoken and unspoken, for the systems around us. The National Equity Project talks about this complex system of racism that we've got histories, policies, and practices that then result in these inequitable outcomes and racial disparities that may reinforce priming associations and assumptions that individuals and groups might hold about other groups of people. And that allows for the perpetuation of new policies and practices and histories. So this, in the center, it says like this sort of implicit bias, system of implicit bias, and in structural racism reinforce one another. So an example that after World War II, soldiers were given an opportunity to have a loan to buy homes. But that loan was denied to Black veterans, whereas it wasn't denied to white veterans. And so a lot of Black veterans were finding that they were not able to buy homes in the same way that their white counterparts were. And what we know from sort of like wealth acquisition is that one of the fastest ways folks can accumulate wealth generationally is by owning a home. So that inability to own a home or processes of redlining then makes people live in certain neighborhoods that are deemed less desirable by the kind of homeowner association and other things that may oh, sorry, just a second. That may then result in these differential outcomes. So we see that school districts, for instance, are paid out of out of the property tax for a neighborhood. So if your property is seen as worth less, then you get less money for your school system. And then how does that shift then some folks' assumptions about who can learn and who is capable within educational settings if folks are working with different sets of materials? And so you can see how this process might go around. Here's some examples of how structural racism might show up. So we see that it's this US News and World report talks about students receiving out of school suspensions by race. And so we see that the percentage of students receiving out of school suspensions is really high, and you see the boys are the blue and the girls are the red, that it's higher for boys across the board, but it's also higher for Black, American Indian, and Hispanic students. And so, and some of that research also shows that it's not about the number of times people get called into the principal's office or get in trouble. It's about what the punishment is that folks receive for those experiences. We also know that COVID has thrown a major, has impacted communities of color in a disparate way. So you see here that the rate of COVID hospitalizations per population that non-Hispanic, American Indian, or Alaskan Natives were like hugely over everyone else as of June 2020. But also non-Hispanic Black and Hispanic or Latino were like at least 4 times more than non-Hispanic Asian or Pacific Islanders and non-Hispanic white. And so something's going on where folks are more, their conditions allow for folks to be more vulnerable to getting COVID and not getting the treatment they need and having to be hospitalized. And so you've got some kind of other factors like this. We also see like racial wealth inequality is rampant in the United States. So, and that's something that people have been talking about more. You see white, Black, and Latino that white folks have an average of 122,000 for their household equity by 2024, whereas the projection is for 1,600 and 1,200 for Black and Latino families. This is another poverty inequality, looking at children who are poor by race. Black, Hispanic, and Black and Hispanic students have a much higher rate of both low income, that's 200% of the federal poverty level, poor, being at the poverty level, or even extremely poor, which is 50%, less than 50% of the federal poverty level. And then unemployment. We look at unemployment that this is right at COVID. We see that spike hit, the unemployment went way up, and then it's crept down, but it stayed up for Black and Hispanic folks over time in a different way than it did for white folks. So everybody's been experiencing challenges with unemployment, but that unemployment rate has impacted different communities. Robin DiAngelo talks about this notion of white supremacy, and I know that this is a term that sometimes frightens people. I think folks get scared of this term, white supremacy, because it sounds like something big and scary, and it is. And it's also the way that I think about white supremacy. It's the way that things operate around us. It's some of the norms and standards that we have. And so Robin DiAngelo, who wrote White Fragility, says it's not simply the idea that whites are superior to people of color, but a deeper premise that supports this idea. The definition of whites as the storm, or as a norm or standard for human, and people of color as a deviation from that norm. One of the examples you can look at to see this is the famous doll study, where kids of all races are given a white doll and a brown doll, and are asked which one's prettier, which one's the bad doll, which one's the good doll. And all of these small children from across race are saying the white doll is the good doll, the white doll is the pretty doll, the bad doll is the black doll. And so this norm gets introduced to us really early. And then one thing before I get off of defining racism that I want to say is that there are different ways that racism shows up. There are ways that we tend to talk about racism more frequently that reflect upon some of the dominant notions of how racism operates. Andy Smith talks about these 3 different ways that racism shows up. That's both historical and current in the United States. The first is exploitation. So slavery, she also says capitalism, that it puts an individual, particularly Black folks in the US, but I think also other groups of folks of color, as property, that their labor gets exploited and built upon. We see this in the prison industrial complex, the very low wage that folks have, but also this sort of rising number of people being sent into incarceration for crimes that did not previously carry incarceration. Genocide and colonialism. So we also have a way in which, particularly for Indigenous folks, that folks are seen as this present absence who are disappearing constantly. So a lot of the sort of ways that Native Americans get talked about aren't grounded in Native American or kind of nation-specific, tribal nation-specific practices. They become these sort of vague, broad ways that we talk about Indians. Which allows us to then, it's like land-grant institutions, sort of like make these folks absent, say they were never here. They were here, this is their land. And so this genocide. And then Orientalism, which is a way in which folks get treated as the others. So I think we see this particularly with Latinx and Asian folks in the United States, and Middle Eastern folks, where they're seen as exotic, as other, but are also seen as a foreign threat. The conversation around immigration often has this anxiety built within it around the outsider coming in. And on our campus, we have a lot of Asian American students who will be asked, "Where are you from?" And the students will say, "I'm from Waukegan." This is the assumption is you must be from somewhere else. You couldn't be from here. Edward Bonilla Silva talks about racism without racists, and he says racism seems to exist pretty solidly without whether or not the individual actors tend to be racist. And I think that's important to note, because as we talk about racism, and talk about racism in the workplace, it doesn't need to be sort of bad apples or evil people carrying on racism, or people who overtly claim to be racist. If racism, like the conversation that Robin DiAngelo talks about with white supremacy, if racism is seen as the way things are, then it looks like the status quo, and it becomes perpetuated in different ways. Paul Gorski, who works with a group called Ed Change, says that the impact of unintentional racism, the ways we participate in and bolster racism without actively trying to do so, is indistinguishable from the impact of intentional racism. Imagining myself a good person as a progressive person means little if I'm not examining and changing the impact I'm having, even through actions I only took without intention. For me, this is really important. When I read this, things made sense in a different way, because I know that for me, sometimes I'll find myself feeling like, I'm a real well-meaning person. I work to challenge racism here and there. In doing so, I might ignore the unintended ways in which folks might say, hey, you said this thing, or you spoke over this person in a meeting. You need to know that this was the impact that had on me. If I feel like I'm a good person, then I might choose to ignore the impact I'm having. But as Gorski says, it doesn't matter whether you intend to or not. If it has an impact, then it has an impact, and we still have to examine those. So racism in the workplace shows up in 3 different spheres, or I'm gonna call them 3 different spheres. One I'll call structural, and in terms of structural, I really mean the structures that exist outside of your professional space. So that might be if you are whatever organization you're working within, what are all of the other places you also come into contact with, or people that you work with, or your clients and customers may also come into contact with. So the full kind of like world that you are set within, and the ways in which racism happens in those spaces. The interpersonal, the ways in which people are interacting with each other, colleague to colleague, colleague to supervisor or boss, boss to employee, customer to employee. So many different kind of relationships there that might exist, some which have power differentials built into them. And then organizational. So organizational are the policies, practices, et cetera. So if we think about the structural, we think about these systems outside of the workplace, the education system, criminal justice system, immigration, government. If we think about organizational, thinking about policies and practices that may unfairly impact employees of color. I still encounter places of business that have dress codes or hairstyle codes that are clearly targeting often Black folks in some way, saying that folks can't wear their hair with dreads, or that, and we've seen that even some of the military units have begun to change the ways that they've been defining this, because this was particularly targeting folks of color in these practices. But I also think that it can be racism when organizations fail to take racial inequality seriously, or fail to do anything about racial inequality that might exist, whether or not they intended for it to exist, back to Gorski's quote. In the interpersonal, then, we think about the interactions between individuals that may convey racist assumptions. Sometimes these get called microaggressions. I was doing a workshop for a college on campus, and one of the faculty members, an older faculty member, president or professor emeritus, he said, in my day, we just called that racism. And I said, that's a really good point. And so we may call these microaggressions, we may just call them racism, but the ways in which people's assumptions, aggressions, assaults, insults may impact another person, which may depend on the status and how formal that interaction is. This includes well-meaning behaviors, which we see a lot of, I think, on our campus. One of the things that, and I think in a lot of organizations, I think sometimes we spend more time trying not to look racist than we do actually addressing the impact of racism. And so some of those well-meaning behaviors come out of that. People saying, well, I don't see race, or trying to sort of be paternalistic, overly friendly, or overly kind of like knowing about the lives of folks of color, or the experiences of folks of color, without a genuine relationship there. So these sort of well-meaning behaviors that are also off-putting. Sometimes folks call this like benevolent racism, so very good, well-meaning racism. And there's a lot of examples of ways that implicitly or explicitly that racism might show up. So in a very implicit example, there's a 2016 study that showed that 31% of Black professionals and 40% of Asian professionals had whitened their resume in some way, which meant they either used a more white-sounding name in their resume, or they took out extracurriculars that might signal in some way their race to the people reading the resume. The research went and said, well, did this work? And it found that Black candidates increased their callback from 10% to 26% by whitening their resumes. And Asians increased their callback from 12% to 21%. Regardless, and this is, I think, an important thing, the company had regardless of whether the company had stated explicit diversity values that they were touting, that didn't seem to matter to whether or not people had increased call. So that's a really interesting example. Another example, also from 2016, found that the experience of racial microaggressions actually was correlated with lower job satisfaction, not surprising. And also something they call detachment coping strategies. So when folks are around experiences of racism, they have to keep their jobs. And so they cope in some way, one of those ways being detachment, not talking about their feelings, not going to people and talking about the things that are going on in the workplace, just sort of like disconnecting from them or dissociating in some way from those experiences of racism that they might have been experiencing in the workplace. So let's talk about anti-racism. So if racism is going on, then, well, we should do something about it. And so that begs this question of anti-racism. What does anti-racism look like? Angela Y. Davis talks about, in a racist society, it's not enough to be non-racist, so we must be anti-racist. And I think many of you all have probably heard the conversation, which isn't simply semantic, but the conversation around non-racist versus anti-racist. And I think that the conversation boils down to this, that simply by not being racist in that moment, that doesn't mean that I'm in any way interrupting the racism of others or the racism of the systems around me. In fact, I may still be receiving privileges as a white person for from the kind of racist system that's around me. So we have to actually work to challenge racism. We have to be anti-racist in that sense. The National Museum of African American History talks about, when we choose to be anti-racist, we become actively conscious about race and racism and take actions to end racial inequalities inequities in our daily lives. Being anti-racist is believing that racism is everyone's problem and we all have a role in stopping it. So thinking about these different levels of what that intervention might look like, I want to start, actually, I'm going to flip these around. But personally, we have work that we are constantly doing. And I say we, knowing that as a white person, I have different personal work that I'm going to be engaged in than a person of color might have. But one of those might be educating ourselves, understanding better about how racism may be operating around us or how it's impacted our lives. I think also, even if for folks of color, there might be ways in which we've bought into that folks of color may have internalized notions of racism about themselves or about other groups of people of color. And so thinking about what education we need to better understand how racism happens. While I think particularly for folks of color, also taking the care of ourselves that is necessary to be able to come to anti-racist work. I think also for white allies, that means taking care of yourself to be able to show up to that and to be able to come with the ability to be reflective and not defensive. Working personally to take perspective and understand others, and also inviting feedback, being able to, I think particularly for white folks or for folks who are working with other groups that they're not a part of, figuring out ways to have genuine relationships and invite feedback. I think interpersonally then, we have a opportunity to open up lines of communication and to acknowledge and admit that racism exists and to figure out together how we might do something about it. And then organizationally, there's lots of strategies for organizations, which I'll talk a little bit about, for organizations to take racism seriously and to actually do their research, to say, I'm going to pay attention to the possibility of racism. Crossroads anti-racist training talks about this movement for a multicultural anti-racist organization, that organizations move from exclusivist organizations that are segregated intentionally, enforcing racist status quos, and moving them to fully inclusive. But along that way, it requires a real identity change for these organizations, and a way in which these organizations make their work about addressing racism, and to doing that in ways that center the voices of the folks of color involved in those organizations. I also want to talk about equity-mindedness, which I find to be an incredibly useful concept. The Center for Urban Education from the University of Southern California talks about this, these kind of 5 points that are ways in which I think both individuals and organizations can be equity-minded and use that focus as a way to do anti-racist work. And the first thing is we have to be race conscious. We have to be aware of and able to talk about race rather than ignoring or pretending that race doesn't exist in the spaces that we're in. We have to be systemically aware. So like that structural piece that I talked about, we have to be able to be aware of how the structures that feed into the place that we're in right now, the organization we're in, are also part of the problem. And so we need to be aware of and responsive to how there's a system of racial and ethnic inequities that our organization may be a part of. So think about, for instance, the preparatory programs that might train people or create a pipeline into our organization. And what do we do when there aren't diverse pipelines into our organization? How do we pay attention to that system? Also, though, we're institutionally focused, so we're also paying attention to what can we change here, and how can we see this as a personal and institutional responsibility of the organization. Also using evidence, also gathering evidence that's necessary to be able to guide this practice. There's a lot of evidence that is available to anything from just looking at who are we hiring and who aren't we hiring, to even how do people feel about being in this space? How do they feel about working here? What is that sort of climate that's going on? And then that we have a responsibility, that this equity advancing, we have a responsibility, even though we are figuring it out as we go, even though it's not going to be perfect, to take action to eliminate these inequities. Little bit about organizations as they work to become anti-racist, but it involves a commitment from everyone, leadership and others. It involves a recruitment, or to work to recruit and retain staff of color, valuing and compensating the contributions of folks of color. One of the well-meaning aspects of racism in an organization I didn't mention before, but that folks of color wind up taking a lot of the emotional labor for both addressing racism as well as for making white people feel better about racism sometimes in organizations. And so serving on all the diversity committees, serving on all the searches because there needs to be a diverse search committee. And that's often not compensated, that contribution. And then kind of embracing this accountability. For individual steps, we've got to educate ourselves. I talked about this a little bit. Reflect upon how racism has impacted us, and build the skills that we need to address racism. Roxane Gay has this fabulous quote. She talks about Black people don't need allies. We need people to stand up and take on the problems born out of oppression as their own, without remove or distance. And at the end, she says we need people to use common sense to figure out how to participate in social justice. And I think that that's a really wonderful point to say. This anti-racism work, if as white people show up to it, it can't be about a paternalism. It's got to be about working alongside one another. Some of the work means that we have to be able to take feedback. We have to be able to receive information about how we might be showing up in spaces, how we might be doing things that that might have racist impacts on others, and make those changes. But also seeking out mentors, building our work both locally and structurally, working to do something, working to be involved and engaged in the spaces we're in. Receiving feedback can be hard. I know that sometimes when I've received feedback, it's made me feel defensive. And so I've had to figure out, how do I work to receive feedback that something I'm doing is harming someone, and how can I take responsibility for that, and figure out what I can do. One thing I do sometimes is just to say, thank you. I need to think about this. I want to come back and talk with you more about this soon. Figuring out how we can receive that feedback as a gift, as the gift that it is, and learn from it, and then stop the pattern, stop the behavior. I want to talk about two more things, and then I want to move us to Q&A. One is, so you're going to be in moments where you witness racism, and many of you have been in these spaces where you've seen racism happen, and you have to figure out how you respond. It may be happening to you, it may be that you're just witnessing it. Some of the things that research talks about is, one, we have to stay grounded, we have to stay present and in the moment as best we can, and figure out then how do we want to respond. Sometimes we think that the only response is going directly up to the person and naming exactly what you saw. I know for me in the moment, I don't know how to name what I'm seeing necessarily, or I need more practice in naming what I'm seeing, or maybe I can talk about it later. But you might also decide that right now isn't the time to talk to this person about what I'm seeing, because it's way too public, they're going to get defensive, or they're going to get shut down. Or I might decide now is exactly the time I need to say it in this big meeting, because if we don't say something, it looks like we're all okay with this thing that went on. So figuring out how and when you respond. A lot of the research talks about focusing on the specific behavior. So naming the specific behavior that you see, and then saying, not saying like, I'm going to interpret this to say you are a racist. I'm just saying, here's that thing you did, and I'm concerned about that because here's how it impacts folks, or here's how I've heard people tell me that they've experienced phrases like that. And I would ask that you do this in the future. Here's a request that I have for you. It's a management strategy that I've heard it called pinpointing or spotlighting before, where you just talk about the behavior and how you'd like the behavior to change. That's a really succinct way of naming for an individual instance. If you're the target of racism, I think there's lots of ways that folks respond. And I know that one of the considerations is psychological versus physical safety. Can I say something? If I don't say something, will that be too harmful for my psychological safety? If I do say something, does that harm my job safety, my physical safety, other kinds of safety? But I think that it's important to find that community to get support and to be able to process, figuring out where you're going to respond, which I think many of you all have worked in organizations and know the different levels of, like, I'm going to have a one-on-one conversation, I'm going to HR, I'm going to report this to the police, I'm going to go to some other entity where that's where the reporting needs to happen. That's really that's going to be up to you and how you figure out you're going to deal with this. Thinking about the consequences of action or inaction. I always want to make sure that people think about how they can strategize with their co-conspirators or their mentors. Sometimes we think we have to do this alone, and even if we might be alone within our workplace, we shouldn't have to be alone any place else in addressing racism. So finding those places of support and people who can help you talk through how to respond. The beauty of anti-racism is that you don't have to pretend to be free of racism to be an anti-racist. Anti-racism is the commitment to fight racism wherever you find it, including in yourself, and it's the only way forward. by Ijeoma Olu, author of So You Want to Talk About Race. And so I think I'm going to end on that. And I see that we have some questions, and I thank you all for the questions. And I want to talk. I'm excited now to hear what some of the questions have been, and hopefully we can talk a little bit. So, David, what do you got for me?
Yeah, thank you, Ross. And can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great, great. I always worry about coming back in on the audio there and and joining back in. But yeah, to your point. Well, first of all, thank you so much for sharing all of that with us and all the attendees. It's been fantastic to listen to, and I'm sure we could go for hours and hours more, as you mentioned at the start. But to jump into a few questions here, I'll start with Janelle wrote in and asked, do you have any recommendations for anti-racist policies an organization or an employer can adopt in the workplace? I'm thinking about something beyond just a non-discrimination policy. And I guess I would add on, is there an organization or company that's doing it well that you've seen out there?
That is an excellent question. Thanks, Janelle. I think that the value statements are nice. I think the value statements can provide a purpose to other anti-racist work that an organization needs to do, because then sometimes in organizations we need permission to be able to do certain things. So in some ways, these sort of value statements can then, if written and embedded in the organization in the right way, can be a way that other arms of the group can say, oh, actually, we need to change the way we do exit interviews because part of the anti-racist statement or the diversity statement or whatever says that we're going to pay close attention to recruitment and retention. We're going to know why people are staying or leaving, and pay attention to patterns that might be happening there, for instance. So I think that there is a way in which the statement work sort of grounds you. I think that probably it depends on what it is the organization that you're a part of does, and in figuring out where the anti-racist efforts and policies need to happen. Usually, I see them happen in a few different things: selection and hiring, the external-facing work that the organization does. So how does it work with others, and what are the ways that it needs to think about its role within the community or its role with communities of color? The kind of retention of staff and employees and students and whatnot, and then the sort of like capacity building and education of the group. So how do we have the skills to be able to do what we need to do in order to counter racism that might emerge in the space. So I think that those are all areas that end up sort of spidering out from some central anti-racism efforts. And usually I see that happen in more like some like UIAA is starting, like some committee efforts that I think then allow for some institutionalizing. So I hope that's a long way of answering, but I hope that answers your question, Jenna.
Absolutely. So we had another attendee write in and say, what should you do when you're the only diverse person in your department and you are constantly being asked to run quote unquote diversity initiatives?
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I think that is an experience I hear about a lot. I have heard of folks finding ways to strategically bring this up to their supervisor or other folks, or to strategically get other people on board to sort of know, hey, this is a problem that this keeps happening. I think sometimes folks are expected to, oftentimes not only are folks of color expected to serve on all these committees, but then they're also supposed to make people feel better about them being on all the committees. So I think that I've heard people sort of navigate that in a lot of different ways, sort of sometimes just drawing a line and saying, you know, I'm on X number of committees. I can't be on any more committees. This is just a boundary. So not, you know, you could choose to not name it about what it is. Or you could choose to have a conversation, a hard conversation with the people you feel like you can have the conversation with about, here's what's happening, and this really needs to be everyone's work. I mean, that's one of the things that I might frame it as, is that when they make you do all of this work, that lets everyone else off the hook, and also doesn't give them a chance to be able to build their skills that they need to be building to be able to confront racism within the workspace. The other thing I would say is I think that this is not an abnormal experience for racist experience for folks of color in the workplace. And so talking with peers and friends and colleagues to maybe folks in other similar entities to say, what are the best ways I could address this? So that's some of the things I'm thinking of.
Great. So Ross, we had a question from Bill. So thank you for raising these issues in such an articulate way. While not to generalize, to what extent, if at all, is racism a generational issue?
I've heard the number of times, so I taught college classes for like 20 years, and the number of times I would hear students say, well, we just have to wait for this other generation to die off, and then we won't have any of these social problems. And I don't believe that's the case. I think that we're hearing folks, I feel like I've heard like 3 versions of this where people will say, oh, look, it's the new racism. And I think that the new racism looks a lot like the old racism. It just sort of takes slightly different forms. And so I think that there are definitely certain things that maybe older generations are less familiar with than newer generations are. I know that on average, people live in more diverse communities than historically. You know, I think that hasn't necessarily measurably changed some of the like other outcomes that we look at. And so more wokeness doesn't necessarily change to not racistness. That's one. So I think we all have work to do, and I think there's a lot we can learn generationally from each other. Which is, for me, it's been really interesting to see this influx of reflections on the 50s and of racism of the 50s and 60s told through today's lens, like the show Lovecraft Country, and seeing like what can that tell us? How does that tell us something about racism today? So, thanks, Bill.
Yeah, Ross. So any advice on how you get organizational buy-in? The attendee goes on to say, especially when the org doesn't want to acknowledge how they contribute to systemic racism. Power dynamics are real, and sometimes it's hard to speak up, and when you do, it's ignored.
So there are different strategies, I think, that folks use to introduce those ideas. There's definitely this concept of managing up. So where you might introduce ideas and concepts in the ways that your supervisor or manager is most likely to hear, because you might know, or your colleagues might know best. Do they like stories? Do they like data? What are the ways that you can frame the issues that you see? Sometimes it might help to make it very personal to the kind of business of the organization you're a part of, to say, here is some of the things that are coming up, or here's, if you want to make it competitive, you can say, here's what people are doing in this other kind of competitive place, the place that we're competitors with, and why we should do some of that work. And one of the things I see, depending on where you stand within an organization to get buy-in, I find that bringing in a group of people to ask the question, ask questions about ways racism might appear, can often be really helpful, because I've been on committees where the people who came to that committee didn't know much about racism before they were part of this task force to look at how racism might show up. And then as they started to answer that question themselves, they began to realize, oh, this is actually something I should be more invested in, and I can take that back to my organization, my unit, and get them invested in this as well. So some of it's about the framing. It might even be, sometimes you have to bring somebody from outside to tell the story that no one will listen to you telling. So figuring out the strategy to sort of incept the idea in there. But really it's about framing. It's about framing it as, here's how it's everyone's problem. Here's why it will benefit the organization. Here's how it will improve, you know, X, Y, and Z about the place.
So Ross, we had Adam write in with a very brief, but I think an interesting question. What countries are considered less racist than the US, and why is that the case? Do we have any theories on that?
You know, that's a good question. I don't know any data that looks at markers of racism from country to country, in part because definitions of race are very culturally bound by a nation. You know, there are certain things that maybe look a little similar that are byproducts of colonization, like colorism, for instance, that we might see happen, or where darker skinned folks get treated less than lighter skinned folks. But I don't know if I can actually answer that question. I know people always say Canada, but Canada's had pretty rough history with their First Nations people, and the ways that they've, you know, historically treated some of their immigrants. So and I don't have an answer for that, but that's a great question.
Sounds good. I know you talked earlier about some of the responding or reacting to racism in the workplace. I didn't know if this would be a different answer to that or not, but how can we respond to a quote unquote weak racist comment in the workplace or in your community? I don't know if the answer is the same as you gave earlier.
A weak racist comment?
Yeah, sorry. Quote unquote
okay.
Weak.
Okay. I guess I don't know exactly what weak means. If it means that like so I guess if it's just like a casual thing, or maybe it's like easy to address in some way. I mean, you might make it. Like sometimes I sort of like frame well, there's two different ways. One, sometimes I might make a joke about how that's not an okay thing to say, or that might be a little bit ridiculous. But the other thing that I think is probably a better answer is to say, let's take it very seriously. Like, so when somebody makes this throwaway racist comment, to say, what do you mean by that? Tell me more. And just to ask them to answer it through its logical conclusion, because oftentimes people don't, they want to just make this comment and back out. But if we ask questions and we take it seriously, that may open up a conversation for us to actually be able to talk about issues we might have, or concerns we might have, or and sometimes it may even allow that person to think through, well, what did I just say? And how would people take that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I know we're at 7 here. I do want to get just a couple more questions in the interest of time, but I want to be respectful of everyone's time tonight. Macy wrote in and said, I'm wondering some strategies I could use to dismantle white supremacy within schools. Specifically, she goes on to say she's an elementary school teacher and her class is predominantly white, and she wants to ensure that she's modeling anti-racist behavior.
That is a great question, Macy. And you're probably aware of a lot of these too as an educator, but some of the things that I've used before for like elementary and middle school work are like the Southern Poverty Law Centers, and I can't remember the new name of the website. It used to be tolerance.org, but anyway, if you look up Southern Poverty Law Center, they have a whole school-based curriculum that's pretty fascinating. Racialequity.org, I think, is another space that has a number of different educational resources, including some that are K through 12 specific, which can offer you some guidance in how to talk about racism. But I actually think that I've known a number of elementary school teachers who've read How to Be Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi, or who've read some other books, just to think about, like, when I'm a white teacher present in the school space, in these diverse school spaces, how do I show up in intentional and unintentional ways, and how might I challenge that? The other thing that I've seen folks find really helpful is creating these pockets of other teachers who are thinking critically about these issues. I know in Champaign-Urbana, there's a pretty awesome social justice educator group that supports one another and helps answer some of these exact questions.
So Ross, I think I'll end with this, and you just gave us a few, I think, really good recommendations, but we've had this question in a few variations, but Shapiro says, what books or other resources would you recommend for people interested in educating themselves on the topic? It's just very hard to figure out where to start on something like this.
That's a great question. I think some of the books that I've quoted here, the Olowo's How to Talk About Race, the Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist. I think that I guess finding what speaks to you. For me, Bell Hooks has always been a really powerful writer, because as a kind of Black feminist, Bell just is very blunt about how things are. There's a book by Janet Helms, as a white person, there's a book by Janet Helms that's called A Race is a Nice Thing to Have, that I found really useful in thinking about whiteness and race, because she, as a Black psychologist, talks about how can we both acknowledge and appreciate our own identities while also showing up to dismantle racism. Because I think sometimes white folks feel like we have to get caught in this guilt spiral when we didn't choose our race. We didn't choose these situations, but we have a responsibility to address them. And there's a lot of so many other awesome things here. And so I would agree that like Yeseo talks about, it's not that there's also racism or horizontal hostility. Sometimes I hear it get called between groups of color, between communities of color, that happens. Maria talks about strategies to identify with more than one diverse community, and this intersectionality. Awesome. I love this conversation. My email is here, and you can always email me if you have. I don't have your emails on here, but if you email me your questions, I'll reply back to you, and happy to engage in a further conversation. So thank you. Thanks, David, UIAA, thanks Career Center, and thanks you all for being here. It's been great sharing this space with you.
Yeah, Ross, thank you. Thank you so much for, again, just sharing, knowledge and your presentation with us tonight. We hope to be able to bring sessions like this in the future again, and I think we certainly will. Thank you to all the attendees tonight. It's been absolutely wonderful having you all with us. We do have a number of other sessions coming up within our speaker series. So again, I would encourage you to keep an eye on your email, check out our website at uiaa.org. You'll see our next one on the screen here is May 6th, Designing for Social Impact, presented by Dr. Lisa Mercer out of our College of Fine and Applied Arts. Should be fantastic. You'll be receiving some information very shortly on that. I would also encourage you to visit alumnilink.illinois.edu. It's our new online mentoring and networking and mentorship platform. You can engage with fellow alumni or students on that platform. You can see some great resources, participate in discussion boards. We will post the session from this evening on there, and we'll also post the session on our website, uiaa.org. We hope to have that up within about the next 7 to 10 days. That's typically our goal with these sessions. So I know that's been a question in the chat a few times. It will be available. Appreciate you all wanting to watch it again and utilize this session moving forward. And again, thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's been an absolute pleasure. We hope to see you at a speaker series event in the near future or at another event with the Illinois Alumni Association. So thank you all. Have a great night and a great weekend. Take care.